good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Also, thank you to my colleagues, Oana and Robin, who are up late here in Germany tonight to join me. They will help us run this webinar hopefully quite smoothly. It's the first time for us to do a somewhat bigger webinar, so apologies in advance for any technical glitches. And also hi to my partner Ricardo, who I think is calling in from San Francisco, because he was actually the first one to fly to the SaaS conference. So while all of us who are looking forward to go to the US this week canceled our trips because of SaaS and everything around the Corona crisis, Ricardo was already in the air when that happened. The webinar will be recorded as well. I think somebody, John Power, hi John, just asked this question in the chat. So yes, it will be recorded, and we will share the link to the recording later. All right, so as I've briefly mentioned already, and as you probably know, I was going to do a talk at the SaaS conference this week, which unfortunately got canceled. And so I thought, let's at least do it as a webinar, and hopefully this is a good time for everyone. Otherwise, there is also another time where we are going to repeat it tomorrow morning, Central European time, in case any of your friends or colleagues is missing it now and wants to join tomorrow. So the topic for today is from mice to whales, and I want to talk about the 5 ways to build a $100 million SaaS company. But before that, just a few quick words about point 9, in case you don't know us well yet. We're an early stage venture capital firm. We're based in Berlin, but we invest all over Europe, as well as in the US and in Canada and in some other countries. We've been around for about 10 years, investing mainly in SaaS, B2B SaaS and B2B marketplace companies. Here are on the screen, you can see the logos of some of the companies that we've been fortunate enough to invest in very early. And you might also know us from these napkins, the SaaS funding napkin, which we've been producing for a couple of years now. And if you'd like to get the paper version of that, just shoot over an email or a note, and we're happy to send you some. Now, let's take a look at this simple chart here. What you can see on the x-axis is the ARPA, the average revenue per account per year. And note that I've used a log scale here. So from one mark to the next, it's always a 10x difference. So the ARPA that I've noted here on this chart are $100, $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, and $1 million. And each of these ARPAs, each of these types of customers can be represented with a different type of animal, a mouse, a rabbit, a deer, an elephant, or a whale. And where this comes from is the way salespeople often talk about customers when they close deals. So many years ago, I heard how salespeople talked about how they closed an elephant or how they closed a whale deal, and this is where this whole animal analogy comes from. Now let's look at the y-axis, and what you can see here is the number of customers. And again, it's a logarithmic scale, so from each step to the next one, it's a 10x increase. And you can see that I have 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and 1 million customers here. And what we can easily see now is how many customers do you need for a given ARPA to get to 100 million in revenue. This is what the topic of this presentation is about. And the mathematics behind this is obviously super simple. It's a simplification. There are many more, like infinitely more ways to get to 100 million ARR by picking a spot on this straight line. It's a huge simplification, but we think it's quite useful. And I think many founders have agreed with us that it's quite useful to simplify it that way, because it forces you to really think about the type of customer that you're going after, which has huge implications on your cost structure, how you do sales, how you do marketing, and many other things. And we'll talk about some of them in the course of this presentation. Now, with that in mind, let's try to find out what kind of animals are the leading SaaS companies hunting, like the ones that actually did get to $100 million in ARR, or sometimes even more than that. And to approach that question, I looked at more than 70 SaaS companies, which pretty much represent all or almost all of the largest and most successful SaaS companies in the world. And with the exception of one company, UiPath, which is an extremely successful but still private SaaS company, all of these companies either are publicly listed, or they filed for an IPO and are about to go public, or they were acquired or merged before going public. So with the exception of one company, all of the data comes from publicly available and very reliable S1 filings. A couple of things to keep in mind though before we proceed. As I've mentioned, almost all of the data is based on S1 filings. Most companies were around the 75 to $200 million ARR mark at the time they filed to go public, but there are some exceptions. But it's still broadly in that range of $100 million, which this talk is focused about. There are a few minor inconsistencies based on the way companies report revenue and customer numbers, like sometimes professional service revenue is included, sometimes it's not included, sometimes the calendar year is different from the fiscal year and stuff like that. So it's not 100% precise, but I think it doesn't really matter for this analysis. But there is one point that does matter, and which is a caveat, and this is that some companies sell to a very broad range of customers with very different pricings, or ACVs, meaning annual contract values. So in these cases, the blended ARPA can be quite misleading, but we'll also talk about some of these specific cases later on. Last but not least, before we proceed, this is how I've categorized the companies into the animal species categories based on their ARPA. So you can see that everything below 333 is classified as a mouse. Everything between 333 and 3.3K is classified as a rabbit, and so on and so on. All right, now with that in mind, let's take a look. So this is the distribution of approximately 70 of the largest SaaS companies into these 5 types of animals. And as you can see here, there are only 3 of them that go after very tiny customers, and which are in the mice hunting category: 12 rabbit hunters, 27 deer hunters, 26 elephant hunters, and 6 whale hunters. So one takeaway here is that most $100 million plus ARR SaaS companies are going after deer or elephants. But also, as importantly, there are successful role models for each type of animal. So if you're if you're the founder or operator of a SaaS company and your ACV is, let's say, in the mice or even smaller or in the rabbit range, then it's not like nobody has achieved $100 million ARR with that type of customer before. But at the same time, like most companies, as we saw, fall into a category where they have somewhat higher ACVs. And maybe the most important point here that I want to point out and spend some time on talking about is that you really have to align your CACs, meaning your customer acquisition costs, with your ARPA, your average revenue per account, and your LTV, your lifetime value, respectively. So if you look at this very simple 2x2 chart, where on the x-axis there is the LTV and on the y-axis there are the CACs, you can see that for each point on this line where one of these animals sit, you can build a very large viable company that managed to balance its LTV with its customer acquisition costs. If you have a large LTV, if you're an elephant hunter or even a whale hunter, then you can obviously spend a lot of money on acquiring customers. On the other hand, it can also be perfectly fine to be a mice or rabbit hunter, but you just can't spend so much on customer acquisition then. You just have to make sure that you don't spend too much on customer acquisition relative to the value of your customers, because then you will end up in this top left in the graveyard quadrant, and that is obviously not where you want to be. So what are acceptable customer acquisition costs? This obviously depends on a lot of factors that are very specific to your business. So all of the numbers that I'm going to present here are kind of samples or examples, and they are based on like some averages as far as like the ARPA is concerned, or our like typical types of animals, and some industry benchmarks as far as annual churn is concerned for this particular type of animal. So we start with the values that you've already seen before on one of the previous slides. We start with the ARPA, which is $100 for the mice hunters and 1,000 for the rabbits, 10,000 for the deer, 100,000 for the elephants, and 1 million for the whales. And then we assume a certain annual churn rate here, which is known to be a lot higher for smaller customers, just because small customers, SMBs, they tend to go out of business at a much higher rate. They are not as invested into your product as the larger accounts. And so the 50%, 30%, 50%, 10%, 70% here is obviously a number that might be different from yours, and then you have to adjust your model. But this is a kind of like a best estimate based on some numbers that we've seen and that we've seen in surveys done by other people. If we have this ARPA and we have this churn rate, and we assume an 85% gross profit margin, which again may be different for you, but this is like a somewhat typical, very high gross profit margin for SaaS, then we can calculate the lifetime value for each of these 5 types of customers, which is just $170 for mice, and then it goes up to $2,800 for the rabbits, and all the way up to $12 million for a whale customer. And now in the last row here, we're going to show what we generally think are acceptable CACs, customer acquisition costs. And the formula that we used here was to say that any CAC that is the lower of 25% of your lifetime value or 18 months worth of gross profit is acceptable. And the reason why I didn't go for just one or the other is that both is important. It's important that you don't spend too much of your lifetime value on customer acquisition cost, but it's also important that your payback time is not too long, because otherwise you can get into cash flow issues. And so based on this simple formula, we're now getting these numbers here as the maximum blended average customer acquisition costs that are probably still reasonable for each of these different types of animals. So what does that mean for your sales and marketing strategy? Well, let's go through that question one by one, and we'll start with the mice. So what does it take to acquire 1 million mice? With a 10% trial to paid conversion, you need 10 million trial signups. Again, like with any of these numbers, and I can probably stop mentioning it now, all of these are just assumptions, best estimates. Maybe your trial to paid conversion is 5%, maybe it's 20%, but it's probably in that ballpark. So it gives you an idea of the magnitude of the trial signups that you need. If you have 0 sales CACs, meaning you spend your entire CACs according to the previous slide, which was $40 per customer on marketing, you can spend $4 per trial sign up on marketing, which is not a lot of money. And the conclusion from that is that most of your leads have to come organically if you're trying to get 1 million mice and 10 million trial signups in order to convert them into those million customers. So you probably need a viral loop. Potentially you could get all of these signups with a lot of SEO, inbound marketing, but it's pretty rare. If you're really talking about millions and millions and millions of signups, there aren't many ways that at least that I'm aware of, that do not involve some kind of product virality. The conversion must definitely be completely self-service. At this ARPA level, you cannot afford to use a sales team, probably not even customer success or extensive customer support. And so these are the limitations that you just have to be aware of when you're acquiring customers of that size. Now, moving on to the next one, what does it take to acquire 100,000 rabbits? With a 10% trial to paid conversion, you need 1 million trial signups. That's 1 order of magnitude less, obviously, than in the previous example, but that's still a lot of trial signups. If in this case, we assume that you spend your CACs equally 50-50 on sales and marketing, then you can spend $35 in terms of marketing costs on each trial sign up, and you can spend $350 per customer on sales. Obviously, the ratio can be very different. Maybe you do mostly marketing, maybe you do mostly sales, but it gives you just a sense for the order of magnitude here. And what that means is that if you have a sales team and they have an OTE, meaning like the on-target earnings base plus commission of $80,000, which is not a lot, at least not for people in the US, then they have to close about 230 customers per year, which is almost 1 per working day. And this is pretty rare. So means 2 things. A large part of your leads need to be coming in inbound, because if you don't get a lot of inbound leads, you have to spend a higher proportion of your total sales and marketing spend on marketing, which means you can spend even less on sales, which means your salespeople have to be even more efficient. And closing one customer per day is already very, very ambitious. So I think if you are a rabbit hunter, you have to get a lot of inbound traffic and trial lists. And the sales must probably be a one call to close or one demo close. It cannot be a more complicated sales process that involves several demos or calls, let alone meetings. Just think about that. If you have to close about one customer per day, and maybe you have a demo to close conversion rate of maybe 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, then the math just doesn't work out unless it's an extremely efficient and extremely short sales process. Now, what about somebody who is going after deer? What does it take to acquire 10,000 deer? In this case, it probably makes more sense to talk about MQLs, meaning marketing qualified leads, because if you're in the deer hunting business, then your conversion funnel is probably somewhat more complicated than just having trial users and then paid accounts. You probably have additional steps. A trial could be one of the ways for the prospect to get involved. It could also be a demo. It could be other types of call to actions. And if you assume that you have a 5% MQL to win conversion rate, which I think is about right in terms of the order of magnitude, but very happy to hear everybody's feedback on this as well. It means you need 200,000 MQLs. Obviously, not today, not tomorrow, not even in the next year, but on your path to $100 million in ARR. And so the question is, are there enough potential customers out there that are more or less actively looking for your product so that you can generate that number of MQLs? The LTV is big enough to spend significantly on marketing and to build an inside sales team. I think that's the good news for all the deer hunters out there. I think the biggest challenge usually is to find ways to scale lead generation at more or less stable costs per MQL. It's not that difficult usually to do it at a very small scale, but by doing it, you basically automatically, by definition, you harvest the lowest hanging fruits, because you are getting the companies that are most interested in your product, that are actively looking already, that have a high amount of awareness already. So that can be quite misleading if you look at your CACs at a small scale and you just extrapolate that, because it might be a lot harder to scale. Which often leads then to the question of, hey, can't we do outbound if nobody's looking for our product, or at least not enough people? Let's just call them up. And if it works, great, because then you've found a way to scale your customer acquisition, maybe not indefinitely, but very much, because if you're not reliant on warm interest, you can just call potential customers from a list of companies in your target industry. That's great. At the same time, it's pretty tough to make the economics work. So for deer hunters, it may work or it may not work. I think you have to test it for yourself. Now, for the last step here, I've combined the elephants and the whales into one category, because I think the kind of like the rules that apply or the characteristics that are true for these two types of customers are sort of similar, or maybe I don't understand them well enough to really understand the differences. If you have any input on that, then I'm all ears. The great thing about being an elephant or whale hunter is that if you have a lifetime value of 1 to 10 million, you can spend a shitload of money on customer acquisition, right? If once you've acquired a couple of customers, then I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not that completely uncertain of how you can get more of them. You can do outbound, you can do field sales, you can do field marketing, you can do account-based marketing, you can do events. And if you've already been in the enterprise sales business for some time, then you can do steak dinners, which I think I never attended, but which seems to be a big thing in enterprise sales, where you put together some of your customers and some of your prospects or other people in the industry into a fancy restaurant, and you eat and you drink, and then hopefully afterwards you have some additional warmer leads. That's usually not something you can afford if you're going after much smaller customers, although some companies got quite creative. I think Zendesk turned steak dinners into more like pizza and beer type events, and I think that was quite successful in the early days as well. So for elephant and whale hunters, the scaling playbook is somewhat clearer. If you have a few million ARR from large customers that pay you 100,000 all the way up to $1 million a year, and they're happy and expanding, you have strong product market fit, then you probably don't have to be crazily innovative and inventive and creative to scale that. The difficult thing though is to get there in the first place. Like, the challenge is to just survive until you're there. It usually takes a lot of money to build an enterprise ready product. So you either have to raise a lot of money up front, or you have to do consulting along the side, or maybe you have to start with smaller customers and grow up market over time, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit in a few minutes. So I think the challenge is somewhat different for these types of animals. It's just pretty hard to get there in the first place. You have to survive the pilot hell, where customers might take a year to decide, and maybe another year until they're through the pilot and all of that. And during that time, it's actually hard to show any meaningful traction to the outside world, which, however, you might need to raise money. Robin, you actually wrote a blog post about exactly that topic, about how to show traction in that very long time, while you have customers who are in pilot but might take forever to eventually convert. Let's take a look at a couple of companies that were very successful, that are either at 100 million ARR or beyond, or that are clearly on their way of getting there. And in some cases, some of these companies sort of broke some of the rules that I've mentioned on the previous slides, or at least they were particularly successful or creative, and therefore worth highlighting. The first one is Canva. Canva, in case you haven't heard about it, it's an Australia-based company that has developed a tool that makes it really easy to create all kinds of different beautiful graphics for posters, flyers, brochures, you name it. It's an inexpensive product. They got to 20 million active users without paid advertising and without an inherently viral product. So they have achieved something which, according to conventional wisdom, is maybe not impossible, but very, very hard and quite rare. And I try to find out or think about, like, why have they been so successful? And the first and foremost, I think it's just an awesome product. People love it. It addresses a pretty universal need, because every business needs some kind of print products, and in many cases, it's a pain to get it done with a design agency or whatever. So it's a painkiller for a pretty universal need. The product is not inherently viral in that it's a digital product with an invitation loop or something like Dropbox where you share your files with somebody, or like Slack where you invite people to a group. But I would imagine that it has a very high wow factor and creates a ton of word of mouth, because like these print products are things, physical products that you share with people, and then maybe somebody asks you, hey, how did you create this? This looks beautiful. How much did you pay for this? So I would imagine that they get quite some referrals from that. And then I think another really killer strategy that they employed was a long tail SEO. So I don't know what percentage of their customers comes from SEO, but it seems to be a pretty large one. And I think they do it very smart by producing a lot of SEO focused content around phrases like, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I create a business card, and on all of that, and combining that with a lot of educational high quality content. So I'm pretty sure that it's also a significant investment that's going into that, but it seems to be working off really, really well. The next company that I want to mention here is one that is very close to us and very close to our hearts, Clio. It's actually the first SaaS company that we invested in at Point 9. I did a few SaaS investments before Point 9, like Zendesk and GeckoBoard, but Clio was the first one with Point 9. We invested in the company about 10 years ago. It's a Canada-based SaaS solution for lawyers, particularly solo lawyers and small lawyers and small law offices to manage their entire law practice. And Clio is a rabbit hunting business, according to our classification, that is on track to reach 100 million in ARR. They're not quite there yet, but it's in line of sight. And they've achieved that without an inherently viral product. There are like some ways how lawyers collaborate with each other on the platform. So there is a little bit of virality, but it's not the main driver for Clio's growth. So how did they achieve that? They too have a super high NPS, and this is one of the themes that you'll see throughout these success examples. They've made big investments early on, again, into content like Canva as well. Clio started doing customer conferences early on. Meanwhile, the Clio Con has turned into one of the biggest industry conferences with hundreds or thousands of attendees. And Clio has also invested quite heavily early on in various types of partnerships, for example, with bar associations, which maybe have not contributed hugely in terms of lead generation, but which were very important in terms of giving Clio credibility and augmenting some of the other efforts. The vertical focus has been extremely important because Clio sells to a super well-defined target audience, which is law firms between 1 and 10 employees, at least early on. Meanwhile, it has expanded, but early on it was really, really narrow. That helped a lot to identify the right customers and to have very high conversion rates. And also worth mentioning is the timing and the patience that it took to get there. So this is a success story more than 10 years in the making. They've been very early for a cloud-based tool for that particular vertical, which gave them a big first mover advantage. But at the same time, it's already more than 10 years in. We're not quite at the 100 million ARR mark yet, which is perfectly fine. But just to keep that in mind, Not every company can grow as fast as Slack or Dropbox or some of these hugely successful examples, which are really like outliers even amongst the outliers. In most cases, it just takes somewhat longer. The next one is also a company from our portfolio. Contentful is a Berlin-based, meanwhile Berlin and San Francisco-based API-first content management system. And what's unusual about Contentful is that Contentful is today an extremely successful enterprise SaaS business with a lot of elephant customers and some whale customers as well. But they haven't always been like this. Like the company started like in a very modest way with less than 700,000 euros in seed funding and a Series A, which today would be in probably a small or average sized seed round, which at that time, however, was a Series A. I think it's part of this is just the timing that at that time financing rounds were just smaller, but part is also that the founders are relatively young. It's not like they've created 3 large companies before. They started this company in Berlin and not in San Francisco. So for an enterprise SaaS company, they were kind of underfunded. So the question is like, how did they get through this? How did they nevertheless be so successful? And a big part of the explanation is that Contentful started as a developer tool with a tiny ARPA. They then gradually moved upmarket over the years, while along the way completely rebuilding the product. And they continuously built out the product and increased ACVs to a certain extent from their existing customers, but even more importantly, by acquiring and attracting bigger and bigger customers and delivering more and more value to bigger and bigger customers. So they started with mice, they moved on to rabbits, to deers, elephants, and at some point in the company's history, I remember we had the first $1 million deal on the table. Dog Planner is again a 0.9 portfolio company. And it's a company that has been started in Poland, but which is very international now. It's a SaaS-enabled marketplace which allows doctors to get better at managing their practice as well as to get new patients. And for patients, it's a way to conveniently book appointments with doctors of various specialties. And one of the things that make Dog Planner very unique is that they use field sales to acquire rabbit customers, which really is not supposed to be happening. It's officially not possible to make the economics work, but Dog Planner has figured it out. And how did they do that? Well, the vertical focus, just like in the case of Clio, plays a huge role there. Dog Planner knows exactly what kind of businesses they can target. It's doctors of a certain specialty in a certain city. It's hyper local. It's hyper targeted. That allows them to really waste no resources on wrong customers and be very efficient in the way they book customer meetings and so on. Another element is that Dog Planner is not only SaaS. When Dog Planner approaches a potential customer, meaning a doctor, the value proposition is not only about workflow and efficiency, it's also about here are new patients that you can get, which is an easier to sell value proposition. So that's an important element as well. There is also awareness for the product amongst consumers or patients, because there is a consumer part of this product as well. So that also drives awareness amongst doctors, which helps with lead generation and sales and conversions. And something very specific about Doc Planner is also that in the countries in which Doc Planner operates, the sales salaries are significantly lower. And one might think that this is offset by a lower price, and because then in these countries the doctors are also like less capable to pay, but it seems like there is still a net benefit if you compare like the salaries that you pay to salespeople in these countries compared to the ARPAs that you can get from doctors. New Relic, another company that I want to talk about here briefly. Not a 0.9 portfolio company, unfortunately. I wish it was. I think we didn't even see them. Probably a bit. They probably started even before our times. New Relic is a great example of a company that morphed from a deer hunter into an elephant hunter. How did they do that? They added several new products. When they IPO'd, New Relic still had only one product, as far as I remember at least. They are now at 4 products, which they've added over the years. And they've been very aggressive and successful in upselling their existing customer base to these new products. They also aggressively went up market and targeted bigger and bigger customers. So bigger customers and more products. And by doing this together, they were able to focus on customers with 100K plus ACV. So if you read their financial statements or like the commentary now, it's all about these 100K plus ACV customers. That's really what they focus on. And 56% of their ARR now comes from enterprises with 1,000 plus employees, and they are now also closing more and more whales. So that's I think it's an interesting example, maybe a lesson that just because you start in a certain customer segment or with a certain type of animal doesn't mean that you have to be stuck in that. The last company that I want to highlight here is a company started in New Zealand called Xero, which has built a $500 million ARR business with an ARPA of just $250. Xero is in case you don't know, it's a cloud-based accounting tool. So how do they do that? They have an invoice portal, which I think gives them some kind of virality, because Xero's customers, when they send an invoice to their customers, then they will see or at least they have an option to see an invoice that is somehow powered by Xero, or there is some payment. So there's a chance that you hear about Xero through that mechanism. I have not seen any numbers though that would give us an indication on how strong of a driver this has been. There are, however, numbers which they've published saying that 60 to 90% of Xero's customers come from one of their accounting partners. So this is really how they got the bulk of their customers. And it makes Xero one of the very, very few SaaS companies that have been able to build out a super successful channel. It's usually something which SaaS companies struggle with, especially in the early days. Xero is, I think, probably like the exception to the rule that this is very hard in SaaS. It also means that they must have built a very significant sales force towards those accountants. So they might not consider their accounting partners customers. For them, they are maybe just partners or resellers or however they call them. but they still have to acquire them. So in a way, there is an elephant or whale hunting business as part of Xero's sales and marketing strategy, despite the fact that their ultimate customers are much smaller ones. All right, I have only 2 slides left with a few takeaways, and then I'm curious to hear if there are any questions or feedback from anybody of you. As a reminder, you can add questions to the Q&A panel or to the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we'll try to address some of them in a few minutes. But before that, just to summarize and repeat again what I think the takeaways of this are. One, most $100 million plus ARR SaaS companies go after deer or elephants or even whales, where you have more proven playbooks to scale customer acquisition. If you want to get to 100 million ARR with mice or rabbits, it will usually require a viral product. But as we've seen, there are some companies that managed to break the rules and created their own playbooks. Dog Planner was one of them, using field sales for rabbit customers. Canva massively leveraging SEO to acquire 20 million active customers. If you're struggling to grow, consider going up market like New Relic did it, or in a way also like our portfolio company Contentful did it. It's something that we've seen multiple times in our portfolio as well as outside of the portfolio, that companies started in the SMB segment, got to 5 million, 10 million, maybe 15 million ARR, but then growth slowed down. Churn was eating up an increasingly high percentage of the new business. And in several of these cases, the solution to this was to go up market and go after a customer segment where you have more favorable economics. It's not a generic recommendation that I can make. It always depends on the specific market you're in, and if there is some pull and if there is a market opportunity in the segment above you. But it's something that we've seen work out really well multiple times. As mentioned before, you don't need a $10 million seed funding round to start an enterprise SaaS company. It might make things easier, but there are several companies in our portfolio as well as outside of our portfolio that started with a smaller seed round and that found ways to just make things work, go up market over time, or were very creative in the way they build their enterprise-ready product. And last but not least, you don't have to be at 100 million ARR in 5 to 8 years, even though maybe that's the investors' dreams. It doesn't have to be that fast. Persistence pays off. We've seen it with Clio. It can be seen with a Procore, which is about to go public. I think is at 300 million ARR or something, but it took them 15 years. So there are lots of SaaS companies out there that started 8, 10, 12 years ago and which are now approaching 50, 100, 150 million ARR and which are huge successes. So SaaS is such a strong business model. The persistence really pays off. That's all I had in terms of slides. Thank you so much for joining us and for listening. And happy to open it up for discussion. And we can also change the status of anybody from attendee into panelist, how Zoom calls it. And then if you want, you can turn on your video camera or your microphone and we can have a chat. So maybe a question to Robin and Anna, if you've if there were any questions that you think we should address.
Yeah, there are quite a few outstanding, I think. I think one question that also a few people upvoted was, do you have any suggestions for how to decide what pricing tier to target?
For a given customer segment, or you think the question is more like, should I go after mice? Should I go after rabbits or deer, or is it maybe both?
Probably it's both, I think, right? But maybe makes sense to start with the latter.
Yeah, okay. I think it's probably something that is somehow related to the whole founding story, right? Like typically founders, when they start a company or when they play around with the idea of a company and then maybe validate some of their hypotheses, it's usually because they've seen that there is a gap in the market for something. So I think they typically have some hunches or assumptions about the type of customer, and then it's about validating that. So I think it's rare that somebody just starts a company and has no idea if he or she should go after rabbits or whales, because there's usually some context around like the ideation that that guides the answer to that question. As for the right pricing, I think it's probably too big a topic to cover within a few minutes, because there's like literally a lot of science around that, and there are some great resources from companies like Price Intelligently, which have produced a lot of articles and webinars and stuff like that just about pricing. I think maybe more pragmatically speaking, I think you just have to start with something and then test and iterate. I think you shouldn't be afraid of testing prices. I think you also shouldn't be afraid of just asking for a lot more than you think you should ask for, at least if you're going after somewhat bigger customers. Enterprises are usually used to paying much higher amounts for anything than the typical startup founder typically imagines. So I think if you're targeting enterprises, you should start and anchor very high. You can always go lower. If it's more on the like rabbit hunting or on that part of the spectrum, you can do a lot of testing and A/B testing and experimentation to find out empirically what the right price point is.
I think we could also take the next question just under it. Let me quickly read it. If you manage to survive pilot hell without investment and now show MRR traction with small elephants, what should be the approach to raising money?
Let me read that as well. If you've managed to survive pilot hell without investment and now show, I mean, I think that's great news. If you manage to bootstrap yourself to that stage, then I think that's it won't be too hard to attract investor interest for that. Obviously, we would still have all the typical questions around what's the market and how strong is the proof of product market fit and all of that. But I think that's generally a very good position to be in. I don't know if maybe the question about like what's the right approach to raising money, maybe the background of this is also like, is that then still a seed round, or is it already a Series A, or is it something in between? I think it depends on how much ARR you have. We typically try to answer or approach an answer to that question once a year with our napkin, so that might give you an indication of like the type of round that you're in. And sorry, now I've talked so much, I need to drink something. Sorry. Let me see what other questions there were. And in the meantime, let me also launch a quick poll here. There is one question here. How does the type of animal correlate to your SaaS funding napkin? In other words, are the multiples valuations in the napkin only applicable to whales or elephants, but not really applicable to mice? Question from Mark Mayona. Yeah, thanks, Mark, for asking this question. I think that in general, well, let me take a step back. I think probably we don't have a big enough database to really have the answers to that. Like, so if we like broke this down by the different types of animals, maybe we would end up having just a few data points per animal per stage. So I think that data from the napkin it will not be, that doesn't give us put us into a position to answer this. Maybe from our experience in working with a lot of other investors as co-investors or follow-on investors, I think generally there are SaaS investors for each end of the spectrum. There are investors that are like more interested in or have more experience with like enterprise SaaS, and then others that are more almost on the consumery side. And you probably want to choose somebody who has like experience with the type of business that you want to build. I think the mice part is a bit of a special animal because the ARPA is so low that it's almost prosumer. So to your question about multiples and valuations, yes, maybe it's hard to really compare like mice with the other animals for the purpose of that. As far as like the rabbits, deer, elephants, and whales are concerned, I think this is really like the typical spectrum of SaaS. Let's see. There is a question about UiPath, and unfortunately I cannot answer this. I don't have any insights into this company in particular. If you do indirect sales like Xero, do you look at the size of the end customer or rather at the size of sales to partners? If you spend money on acquiring these partners, which then in a next step acquire customers, then what you want to know to find out if this can become a scalable, profitable channel, you'll want to know what does it cost to build this channel, which can include all the costs associated with that channel, with acquiring these partners, taking care of them, maybe supporting their sales and marketing efforts towards the end customers. So on the CAC side, I would include all of that. And on the revenue side, then I think I would include, I would consider all of the revenue from the customers of one partner and consider that as the revenue that you generate in exchange for the acquisition costs of that partner, but also factoring in like marketing to support them. So if your main sales and marketing activity is to acquire these partners, then I would look at it as at the partner level. But obviously, the revenue still comes from the end customers, but you can still figure out or calculate what is revenue that you can attribute or that you can generate from one of these partners. And now maybe we have time for one or two more questions, because I think we are officially over time already. I can see one here. Is it possible to build inbound and outbound for both animals, rabbits and deers, at the same time? I think the typical journey is that you start to do inbound. It just usually makes more sense to start with customers that are somewhat further in their discovery process. I think doing outbound early on can be interesting to prove that it works, because then you have more confidence that there is a scalable customer acquisition channel once inbound starts to be exhausted. But generally, I wouldn't recommend to think about like outbound too much early on. I think a separate category of this is just like the VIP outbound or network outbound, where it's quite normal and obvious that if you want to get some customers in the beginning, you just ask everybody who you know for referrals. So that kind of outbound, I think, is a no-brainer. But when it comes to building a real outbound force, it usually comes after inbound, and you probably cannot build at both things at the same time, just from a focus and resource perspective. But later on, obviously, when you have a lot more resources, yes, you can do, and you probably have to do both things at the same time. There is an anonymous question here. Rabbits 333 to 3K ACV is a broad range. Can you expand on marketing strategies and CAC with some examples? Yes, it's true. It's a very broad range, and that's simply for the mathematical reason that I've covered a range of 5 orders of magnitude with 5 types of these animals here. So therefore, with respect to each of these animals, there is a 10x ARPA range. Let me take a look at the question again. I lost it somehow here. Okay, yeah. So can you expand on marketing strategies and CACs with some examples? In that range, it's rare that you can make outbound work, or let alone field sales. I mentioned Dog Planner as kind of like the exception that proves that rule. Usually, it's hard to make it work. So it's more likely in terms of marketing strategies that you would make inbound work with a lot of focus on SEO, content, some paid acquisition, and most importantly, I think you need a great product with a very high NPS. I think if you had to rely completely on paid, then it probably wouldn't be a great business that you're building. I think with that, we have to wrap up, but thank you so much, everybody, for your attendance. I will also now end the poll so you can see the results. And interestingly enough, you have this subset seems to be a very successful one, because it looks very similar. The distribution, I think, looks very, very similar to the distribution amongst the $100 million ARR companies that I showed you on one of the earlier slides. Actually, you cannot see it yet, can you? Now you should be able to see it.
No.
Now you can see it. So if you look at the distribution of these bars, it's almost the same. All right. If I haven't been able to answer your questions, I'm sorry. Please feel free to join again when we do this next session tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Central European Time, or send us your questions over email, and we'll try to answer them there. And with that, thanks again, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day or good night, depending on where in the world you are. Take care.
Bye, everyone.